Hi everyone, my name is Anna Kawakami and I'm a PhD student in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon, previewing research on improving human-AI partnerships in child welfare, understanding worker practices, challenges, and desires for algorithmic decision support. And this work was conducted alongside a great team of co-authors shown here. AI-based decision support tools, or ADS, are increasingly deployed across complex, high-stakes decision-making contexts. For example, you may have seen recent news on the use of algorithms to assist frontline decision makers in social work, criminal justice, or healthcare. These tools have been introduced to these contexts with the hopes of helping to overcome limitations in human decision making. But at the same time, AI-based judgments are themselves imperfect and biased, even if in different ways from humans. We see growing recognition of this duality in popular discourse. For every news headline you see today espousing the promise of AI to improve upon flawed human systems, there's another discussing ways AI risks making things even worse. Given the potential for humans and AI systems to build upon each other's strengths and compensate for each other's limitations, recent research has sought to find ways to design for effective human-AI partnerships, configurations of humans and AI systems that can draw on complementary strengths of each. Yet it remains an open question how to achieve such synergy. Today, in the United States, child welfare agencies have started to adopt ADS in their workplaces. In 2016, Allegheny County's Department of Human Services deployed an ADS called the Allegheny Family Screening Tool, or AFST. The AFST assists social workers in making screening decisions about potential child maltreatment cases. Call screeners gather various sources of information to run the AFST, which outputs a score between 1 for low risk of future out-of-home placement and 20 for high risk of future out-of-home placement. Beyond Allegheny County, other public sector agencies are increasingly starting to look at the AFST as an example of what AI-assisted decision-making can or should look like in child welfare. The HCI, ML, and FACT research communities have also frequently studied the AFST in prior work. However, most existing research on the AFST, and more broadly on ADS and social work, have relied on retrospective quantitative analyses of workers' decisions or large-scale crowd experiments that simulate decision tasks, but abstract away from the context in which workers make decisions. Today, there's limited understanding of how workers actually use the tool in their day-to-day work. We therefore sought to understand how this ADS got situated into the workplace after nearly half a decade of use. The stakes of workers' day-to-day decisions cannot be overstated, as they face a challenging balancing act, erring on the side of child safety versus erring on the side of family preservation. In this paper, we present the first in-depth qualitative investigation of workers' current practices and challenges and working with the AFST. We asked the following questions. How do workers decide when, whether, and how much to rely upon algorithmic recommendations? And what limitations and future design opportunities do workers perceive for the AFST or future ADS tools? To address these questions, we physically visited the Child Welfare Agency twice over the course of 2 weeks to conduct contextual inquiries and semi-structured interviews with 9 call screeners and 4 of their supervisors. We observed call screeners taking calls, compiling case reports, running the AFST, and making screening recommendations. We also observed supervisors using these screening recommendations alongside the AFST scoring case reports to inform their final screening decisions. In short, we found 4 high-level themes around what factors guide workers' reliance on the ADS. To start, we observed that workers use their knowledge of rich contextual information of a given case, which isn't captured by the administrative data that the model uses. Workers appear to compensate for gaps and limitations in the model's risk scores by leveraging their understanding of case-specific context from allegations. For example, they consider potential cultural misunderstandings or ulterior motives of the callers to inform their decisions about whether to override a high-risk score. These findings confirm hypotheses from D'Artiga et al. That workers can detect and override erroneous AFST recommendations by cross-checking algorithmic outputs with other case-related information. It additionally raises questions around the validity of online studies replicating decision tasks where the AI has access to a superset of task-relevant information. So we also found that workers form beliefs about the ADS's capabilities and limitations relative to their own, in part informed by this contextual information. Workers in Allegheny County are intentionally given minimal information about how the AFST model works to discourage gaming behavior. But we found that because of limited authoritative information on the model, workers improvise strategies to learn about the model on their own. So as an example, they played guessing games with their colleagues where they would gamble on what the risk score might be, honing their ability to predict the scores over time. Through learning strategies like this, workers built up their sophisticated yet imperfect beliefs and intuitions about the model's behavior. They use these beliefs, such as the type and influence of predictive features the model uses, to calibrate their reliance on algorithmic recommendations. Given the influence workers' informal beliefs had on their use of the tool, it's unclear whether the agency's goals for limiting model transparency were actually achieved. Yet this lack of transparency had other consequences. Overall, workers tended to be distrustful of the tool, and they didn't feel equipped to work with it effectively. Additionally, we observed that workers' decisions to rely on the algorithm were influenced by organizational pressures and incentive structures around the use of ATS. While prior literature often discusses human reliance on algorithmic output in terms of how well calibrated an individual's trust is on a given algorithmic system, these findings surface the importance of considering organizational context. For example, workers talked about how the organization monitored performance measures, assessing how frequently they disagreed with high-risk scores. Some described that they sometimes agreed with a high-risk score against their best judgment to avoid being perceived as disagreeing with the AFST too often. Others described how they felt their expertise as human decision makers was being undervalued, given decision protocols that discouraged disagreement with the AFST score. Finally, workers were aware of misalignments between algorithmic predictions and their own decision targets, and this influenced whether they relied on the ATS. Workers described that they make their decisions based on immediate safety concern for the child. On the other hand, the model predicts the risk of out-of-home placement in 2 years. Workers described they fundamentally disagreed with, were concerned about, or didn't know how to practically incorporate predictions of longer-term risk into their decision-making processes. Overall, even though the AFST has been used for nearly half a decade, the system remained a source of tension for many workers. As it exists right now, the tool is perceived as a missed opportunity to effectively complement workers' own abilities as human experts. In the current literature, there are 2 prevailing narratives around how frontline decision makers calibrate reliance on ADS. They are often too skeptical of useful ADS outputs or too reliant upon erroneous or harmfully biased ADS outputs. But our findings revealed a much more complicated picture that's not fully captured by either of these 2 narratives. So in the paper, we highlight model level, interface level, and organization level implications aimed towards both researchers and public sector agencies. For example, we suggest designing training and decision time interfaces that support workers in understanding the boundaries of an ADS's capabilities, exploring methods to support diverse stakeholder involvement in shaping an ADS's model level design decisions, and clearly communicating and in points of disagreement, collaboratively determining with workers how decision-making powers should be distributed across workers and the ADS. As a reminder, in this presentation, we gave a high-level preview of our research findings and implications. If you're interested in learning more, we hope you read the full paper. Finally, we would like to acknowledge and thank folks at Allegheny County for their valuable input and commitment to transparency that shaped this research. Thank you so much for listening to our presentation, and please do reach out if you're interested in chatting.